Hello, grade 12s. I hope that you're having a lovely day so far. Today, we will be completing the section of work on team performance and conflict management. In this lesson, we will be exploring conflict in terms of what it is, in terms of what some of the causes of conflict are, in terms of how to deal with conflict in the business, and then give suggestions as to how we can possibly avoid conflict in the business. Then we will also be looking at a process called grievances, and we'll look at how to deal with grievances in the workplace and what steps the employee can take in order to deal with these grievances. Finally, we will be providing suggestions as to how to deal with difficult people with difficult personalities in the workplace. So it's important to understand that conflict is something that exists in every business and in with every team. Conflict can be described as a disagreement between two or more people. There may be a clash of opinions or ideas between these people. And what's important to understand is that conflict will create tension in the business. And this tension will act as a barrier to achieving the goals that the business has to achieve. So let's take a look at some of the causes of conflict in the workplace. People in the workplace all have different backgrounds, cultures, values, beliefs, languages, etc. This will mean that people will view things very differently, and because they view things differently, it may create conflict between teams or between people. Limited resources may create conflict in the workplace as well. When people have to compete for resources, it means that they cannot perform their duties properly, as they might need to share resources and they might need to wait for someone to be done with resources in order for them to complete their work. For example, if two people need to type reports, but they are sharing one computer, then this will create conflict in terms of who gets to use the computer first, how long they get to use it for, and so on. So if they each had their own computer, then there would be no issue. But because there's a lack of resources, conflict can be created between the people that need to use those resources. When team members have different goals or objectives within the business, they might end up working against each other or do things that act as barriers to each other. So one team might be operating towards one goal, and another team might be operating towards another goal, but those two goals work against each other and they might be counterproductive for one team or for the other team or for both teams. So this will create conflict in the workplace. That's why it's important to ensure that everybody in the workplace is working to the same goals and that all these goals are aligned within the various teams so that they are not counterproductive towards each other. Personality differences will result in conflict as well. This is because people with different personalities act differently towards each other. Sometimes people with personalities that are too similar or too different might not agree with one another, creating conflict in the workplace. People with different opinions on a particular matter will never be able to agree, especially if they both feel strongly about their opinion on a particular matter. For example, if I was to ask you, or if I was to ask a Man United fan and a Liverpool fan which team is better, they will never agree with this because they each are passionate about their team and they each will feel that their team is the best team. So they will never be able to agree with each other, and things like this happen in the workplace which may cause conflict in the workplace between either people or between teams in the workplace. Then unfair treatment in the workplace will cause conflict between co-workers and will cause tension. And whenever there's tension, there is always going to be conflict. So if one party is treated differently than another party, then it will seem like there is favoritism and automatically the one party will have a resentment towards the other party. For example, if you and I both arrive at work late every day, I get called into the office and I'm given a warning. You get called into the office and you are just told not to be late, but you don't receive a warning. Then both of us have been treated unfairly because we have the same um, same thing that we are doing wrong in terms of coming to work late every day, but we are not being treated fairly. I received the warning and you received nothing, just a verbal conversation saying that you must not be late anymore, and I therefore will resent you because you weren't treated fairly and we both had the same transgression. So there will be conflict between you and I, and between you and the manager who has treated us, or between me and the manager who has treated us unfairly. Then when there are unrealistic expectations, then people will not be happy working towards that goal. So if I set you a goal that is unreachable or unattainable, that can never be achieved, and you know that this can't be achieved, then you will not work to your best of your ability, because you know no matter how hard you work, you cannot achieve that goal. So it's going to create conflict because you know that you are working towards an unrealistic goal, so you are bound to fail, and you don't like to fail, and that's going to cause conflict because you might approach me and say, this is an impossible target, and I might not agree with that, and there's going to be conflict between you and I. So unrealistic expectations in the workplace can cause conflict as well, and can also cause unnecessary stress. Right? Then sometimes there's unfair distribution of workload between members. So sometimes there are 5 people on a team and we're supposed to divide the work fairly so that everybody does the equivalent amount of work depending on our position within that team. But if we are 5 equal employees employed to do the same thing, the work should be distributed evenly because we are going to be paid accordingly. And when one party is given more work than the other party, it's going to create a resentment. So, for example, if it's Friday afternoon and we're supposed to leave work at 5 o'clock, and the boss comes in and tells me I've got to do 2 hours of extra work, which means I can only leave at 7 o'clock, but then you can leave at the normal time at 5 o'clock. But we're both supposed to be doing this work. And because the work has been distributed unfairly, I have to work longer. You're going to go and start your weekend at the normal time, and that might create conflict between you and I, or between me and the manager. So when workload is not distributed evenly or fairly according to what our role is in the business, then there's going to be conflict, especially if we are overloading one person. Then it might seem that to be of favoriting or there's going to be a favoritism with another person. Okay, then when stress is not managed well, then this can cause conflict as well. So obviously we know that we don't perform optimally when we are working under pressure or when we are stressed. So it is our duty as the employee as well as the business to help us to control our stress so that we can manage our job properly, because what stress does is it puts us in a position where we are anxious, we are not comfortable, and then when we communicate with other people, we might not do it in an appropriate manner, or we might treat people unfairly, and then because of that, then there's going to be conflict between you and I. So I might be very stressed, and I come to work and you just greet me and I tell you to, in a very, or I don't greet you back, or if I'm rude towards you because I'm stressed, then that's going to create conflict between you and I. Okay, then a lack of communication or poor communication between managers and co-workers will lead to conflict, because if we don't get the adequate information, or if we don't receive all the information we are supposed to be receiving, then we are not going to do our jobs properly. So if I get half the information and someone else gets all the information, when we do our tasks, we are working towards different goals, and then we are not working optimally. And if we are supposed to be working together, there's going to be conflict, because you're going to think I know everything I'm supposed to be doing, and you don't know that I haven't received all the information. So when there's a lack of communication, it means that the people will not be on the same page and they won't work well together as a team. So it's important for the managers and the leaders to make sure that all the necessary information is given to the right people at the right time, so that there's no confusion in terms of what needs to be done. As we can see, there are many causes of conflict in the business, and conflict will always exist. That is guaranteed in the workplace. There will always be conflict. Therefore, conflict resolution, or how we solve the conflict, will also be an ongoing process all the time. So now that we know what some of the causes are for conflict, let's see what we can do in the workplace to deal with conflict when conflict arises in the workplace. When dealing with conflict in the workplace, we firstly have to acknowledge that the conflict exists in the workplace. We need to be able to identify that it can exist before we can resolve it. So if we don't acknowledge that there's conflict, then we won't know that there is a tension or a conflict that needs to be resolved. Then once we have acknowledged the conflict exists, we need to identify the causes or the cause of that particular conflict. We might decide that we're going to have pre-negotiations where all the complaints will be allowed to be viewed by the complainant. So each person that is involved in the conflict will be allowed to state their case separately. So we're not going to have the two parties or the teams or whoever's involved in the conflict. We're not going to have them all together. We're going to allow them to separately state their case, and this will provide insight into the problem and allow each party to express their views without making the conflict worse. Because sometimes what happens when you have all the conflicting parties in one meeting together at a specific point of time explaining what has happened, then they might argue some more, they will interrupt each other, people might not feel comfortable to tell the full story and so on. So that's why we might decide to have these pre-negotiations where each complainant will be allowed to state their view separately, so the other parties will not be involved in this process. They will have their own opportunity to state their case, and this is a good process to have because it does provide insight into what the problem is from all the different viewpoints. Then we have to set a time and place to have a meeting where all the parties involved in the conflict are present. At this meeting, we have to make the intention for this intervention clear so that all the parties know exactly what this meeting is about, and it will put them at ease. So if parties have had conflict over a particular issue, we will tell them that this meeting is about this conflict that has arisen, and this is our intention for the meeting, and this is what we would like to achieve by the end of this meeting, so that everybody knows exactly what this meeting is about and everybody is sort of put at ease during this meeting. Then during this meeting, each party will be allowed to express their opinion, their view, their feeling, etc. with regards to the conflict that has arisen, and in this process, the various parties involved in the conflict might actually recognize how the other person has viewed the incident, and this might provide an opportunity to create understanding between conflicting parties. So there might have just been a misunderstanding. The one person viewed it in one way and the other person viewed the conflict in another way, and this is why the conflict has arisen. So this process might actually iron out that issue, and everybody will get an understanding from each other's viewpoints. Then we'll also have a discussion after each party has presented their feelings or their opinions, etc. We'll have a discussion to try and find a solution for this conflict. But what's important in this process is that all the parties involved in the conflict need to work together to find a solution that they all agree with. If all the parties agree with the solution, then they will be more than happy to implement the solution to ensure that the conflict doesn't exist or doesn't rise again. If any of the conflicting parties do not agree with the resolution, they will not apply the solution that is going to be implemented, and then the conflict may not be solved, or it might cause further conflict. So it's important that when you are finding solutions, that the parties involved in the conflict are all happy with the solution, because if they are all happy with the solution, it means that they will abide by the conditions and the prescriptions that are made by that solution, and then that will help to ensure that this conflict doesn't rise again. Okay, then, as with any process, we also need to monitor the solution to see whether the conflict has improved to see whether the conflict has been resolved or whether the conflict has even in fact got worse. But we need to monitor the situation and monitor this conflict to assess whether our solution has been successful or whether we need to adapt it slightly or whether we need to come up with a new solution completely. But with every conflict that exists in the business, you will go through these processes, and obviously it's different depending on the different conflict that rises in the workplace. Some issues will take longer to solve, some issues can be solved in a few minutes. So depending on the different level of conflict that exists, this process can take a long time or a very short time. We have mentioned that conflict will always exist in the workplace, but there are some ways we can try to prevent conflict from occurring in the workplace. Firstly, we can formulate clear policies. These policies will guide the behavior of your employees and possibly prevent conflict in the workplace. For example, if management has made it policy to wear certain safety equipment in the workshop, then people must wear the safety equipment, even if they don't agree with it. There will be no room to argue because this is policy that has been implemented in the workplace. So the policies that have been implemented should be communicated clearly to all the employees to make sure that they understand this clearly, and it may have to be done in a language that they understand. So this is done to avoid any confusion that might be happening in the business with regards to the policies that have been implemented in the business. Employees must also be familiarized with all these policies on a regular basis, and there should be a place where these employees can go and look at these policies whenever they need to look at these policies. In a workplace, there can also be grievances, and this occurs when a group or an individual in the business has a work-related issue. It usually takes place when an employee is unhappy or has a complaint in the workplace. Let's take a look at the procedure that should be followed when dealing with grievances in the workplace. When dealing with a grievance, an aggrieved employee must first verbally report a grievance to their immediate supervisor, who must try and resolve this in 3 to 5 days. If the supervisor cannot resolve the issue, then the issue can be taken to the next higher level of management, and hopefully they will be able to solve the issue. So the idea is that your grievance is first solved by your immediate line manager, and if your immediate line manager can't solve the issue, then you can bring the next level of management in to look at the issue at hand that needs to be solved. Then let's assume that the manager or the next level of management cannot solve your issue or solve your grievance. Then they're going to ask the employee to formally lodge a grievance in writing, and then the business will respond in writing as well. So when you lodge a grievance formally, you have to do this in writing, and the business must then also respond to you in writing, acknowledging that they have received your formal grievance. Then a meeting needs to be organized and a grievance hearing will be held with all the parties involved in the issue attending this meeting. All the minutes of this meeting, as well as any resolutions, must be recorded in this formal grievance form. So the idea is to record all the minutes, so that tells us what was discussed in this meeting, as well as any solutions or resolutions that we have agreed upon must be recorded in this formal grievance form. This is what we use to keep track of the grievance in terms of how it's going to be resolved. So the aggrieved party and the business will come up with some sort of resolution, and they will each have their role to play in this resolution. So if any of the two parties, either the business or the employee, don't uphold their end of the resolution that was decided upon by everybody, then we can come back to these minutes and say, this is what we actually decided we are going to do, and you are not upholding your end. So now we need to just remember what we discussed in our meeting and what our solution is going to be and what your role is going to be in that solution to make sure that the grievance is solved. So we can use this as a way to monitor and to remind any party involved in the conflict what was decided upon. Then, if the aggrieved party is still not satisfied with that the grievance is solved, or they're not happy with the way that the issue was solved, then they can take this issue up with the CCMA. And the CCMA stands for the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration. Okay, so their purpose is to resolve any workplace grievance that exists. And if at this point the grievance is still not solved, then the aggrieved party can take their issue to the labor court, and the labor court is the highest court or the highest authority in terms of any workplace issue. So whatever the labor court decides is law. So if whatever they say must happen, must then in fact happen. And if your grievance is not upheld, or if you are unsatisfied with the decision of the labor court, then your final step that you can take is to approach the labor appeals court, and then they will re-look at your case. And obviously whatever is decided in the labor appeals court will override the original decision that was made in the labor court. So if you have an issue in the workplace, there are quite a few channels you can follow. You can go to your immediate supervisor, you can go to other levels of management in your business, you can approach the CCMA, you can go to the labor court, and then finally the labor appeals court. We have briefly mentioned the CCMA, but let's take a quick look at what it is. So the CCMA stands for the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration. And the purpose of the CCMA is to resolve any workplace grievances. So it's important to know what conciliation means, what mediation means, and what arbitration means, and what these processes involve. So when looking at conciliation, conciliation occurs when the disputing parties get together. So all the parties who are involved in the grievance, they get together with a third party, and this third party is a neutral party. So they are an independent person, or they are independent of the issue that is going on. They won't provide any benefit for either of the two conflicting parties. So there need to be a neutral third party, and all the conciliator does is he merely assists the party to try and reach an agreement. So the conciliator does not decide what is right or what is wrong, or who was right or who was wrong. They merely try to assist the parties to have a constructive conversation, a constructive meeting where the parties involved in the grievance can reach an agreement together. So the conciliator doesn't have any rights. They're just there to try and make sure the parties can reach some sort of agreement. With mediation, a mediator will assist in resolving the conflict by listening to the conflicting parties and then making certain suggestions. And these suggestions made by the mediator are not binding, so the mediator can't decide what the solution is going to be. The conflicting parties still have to decide what the solution is going to be, but the mediator will be equipped to make suggestions as to how to get to the solutions. But it's not up to the mediator to decide what the solution is going to be to solve the grievance. They're just simply going to be giving suggestions, and the aggrieved parties or the parties involved in the grievance will still come up with a solution together. The final word is arbitration, and arbitration occurs when there is an arbitrator who hears both sides of the grievance and then makes a decision about who is right or who is wrong. So the difference here between the arbitrator and the mediator and conciliator is the arbitrator actually has the right to decide who is right in the grievance and who is wrong, and the arbitrator can actually come up with a solution. So the arbitrator can decide who's right and who's wrong, and whatever the arbitrator says is binding for both parties. So there's no appeal against the decision, although the decision can be reviewed if it is possible to do so. But the arbitrator has the right to decide who's right and who's wrong, and what the process is going forward. So the conciliation involves a conciliator who only assists a meeting between the aggrieved parties but does not decide who's right or wrong, does not give any suggestions. He's just there to make sure that the meeting can happen peacefully and that the two parties can reach an agreement together. The mediator will give suggestions, but the suggestions are not binding, and an arbitrator can decide who's right and wrong, and whatever the arbitrator has decided is going to be binding. Managers are expected to be able to deal with conflict and grievances as they occur in the workplace. In addition to this, they also need to deal with difficult people that might be on the staff. Therefore, it's important to teach yourself as a manager how to deal with difficult people. And the reason why we might have difficult people to deal with is because we have so many different personalities on our staff. And each personality trait will bring a different challenge. And managers need to know how to manage all these different personalities in order to get the best out of that employee. So let's explore how we can manage the difficult personalities in the workplace and what we can perhaps do to get the best out of the employee, because at the end of the day we still have a goal that we need to achieve and we need that person in order to achieve the goal. The first difficult personality that we have to deal with is a negative person. So when dealing with a negative person, we need to listen to the negative person, we need to listen to what they are saying, but we do not necessarily have to agree with this person. So we're going to listen to what they say, we're going to give them a chance to explain their issue, but we don't have to agree with it. However, with the negative people, we have to be firm and we cannot allow their negativity to influence any other people. We can see this in the workplace very often, where one negative person can influence another person, and then suddenly you have two negative people and three negative people and four negative people. We can't allow this to happen in the workplace. So we need to make sure that whenever we identify someone being negative, we approach them and we ask them to discuss their issue, why they're being negative, and we listen to them, but we don't necessarily have to agree with them all the time. But we can't allow them to influence anyone else to become negative in the workplace. The next difficult personality is the complainer. This is someone that complains about everything, and there's always going to be complainers because we can't satisfy everybody in the workplace. But the idea is, with the complainer again, try and listen to their complaint, but we can't acknowledge all their complaints because sometimes the issue is not actually a workplace issue as well. So we listen to their complaint, we try to understand their complaint, but we don't have to acknowledge their complaints all the time. Then we have another type of personality, which is someone that is over eager, or someone that agrees all the time, or over agreeer, someone that just says yes to everything and they make promises for everything and they cannot live up to their promises. So these people are people pleasers. They try to do everything in the business, they take everything on, and then their workload becomes too much and they can't actually perform their duties. So if you identify someone that is an over agreeer or someone that's just a yes man, or that says I will do everything, promises you everything, you got to make sure that you don't let them not keep their promises. So you have to make sure that if they say they're going to do something, you are following up on their actions to make sure that they are actually achieving what they said they are going to achieve. And with these types of people, they tend to take everything on board. So if we ask them to do 5 things, they'll do all 5 things. So we also, as a manager, need to make sure that we don't overload these people, because sometimes people don't always have the ability to say no. They will just say yes when anyone asks them to do anything, and that creates an even bigger workload, and in time they're going to be burnt out. They won't be able to do their job properly, and you can't allow this in the business. You have to make sure that you are managing these people to make sure that they are doing what they are promising that they are doing, and they are not being overburdened by their personality of agreeing to everything. Okay, then in the workplace, you also have quiet people. And with quiet people, they like to work in quiet spaces. So you cannot fill their spaces with lots of noise, because then you're going to irritate the quiet people, you're going to place them under stress, and they won't be able to perform in an environment that they like to work in. So with the quiet people, you have to give them time to respond and then wait patiently for them to, or for their response. So you've got to be patient with them. They will not necessarily give you their opinion in a place that is noisy or in a big meeting with lots of people, but they might give their response in a different form. But you've got to be patient with them and wait for their response. But you obviously can't wait forever, so there's got to be a time limit attached as well. Okay, then the next personality we have to deal with is the expert, so the person that knows everything. And these may be actual experts in the business. So when someone is an expert, they tend to feel that nobody can tell them anything about what they are experts in. So they tend to believe that they are always going to be right within their field of expertise. So with expert people, when you are approaching them, you have to be firm and assertive, because they are experts, they are going to be firm and assertive. So therefore you have to be firm and assertive as well. And when you're taking any issue to them, or you're dealing with an issue, you have to go with facts. So you have to really be knowledgeable about the issue, and you got to try and make sure that you're not accusing them of being wrong, because the worst thing you can do to an expert is accuse them of being wrong, because usually the experts are more knowledgeable than the managers as well. So we need to deal with these people quite carefully. So we got to make sure we know all our facts and try to approach them in a way that's not accusing them of being wrong, because if we do that, we are not going to get the best out of that person. Then the next personality that we might find in the business is an aggressive or an angry person. And often people with angry or aggressive tendencies, or they become angry in that moment, you have to allow them the time to actually blow off steam. So when they are in a state where they are angry or they are aggressive and loud, you have to give them their time to just blow off steam. And then once they've been calmed down, then you can approach them to speak to them about their issue. You can't attack them while they are in a state of anger, because you are only going to fuel their anger and it's going to make it worse. So when somebody has an angry personality as one of their personality traits, you have to wait for them to be calm before they can be addressed. And especially don't tell an angry person to be calm when they're angry, because that's also going to fuel them. So rather give them their space, let them blow off steam. You can listen to what they're angry about, but you just let them blow off steam and get everything off their chest, and then you can deal with their issue that they are dealing with once they are calm. And the last one is an indecisive personality, so someone that can't make decisions, and because they can't make decisions, their work is delayed or their work doesn't get done. So with indecisive people, you have to provide them with strict guidelines and procedures and processes that they can follow, because if they can follow the processes, they don't have to make decisions. But you also have to explain the importance of decision making. So if there comes a time when they have to make a decision, they must be willing to make the decision, because if they don't, there can be negative impact on the business. So you have to explain to them the importance of making a decision, but you got to also provide them with a set of guidelines or rules or procedures or steps to follow, so that they can just go and follow those steps where they don't have to make that many decisions. But there are lots of different personality types in the business, and as a manager you have to know all these personality types, because at any point in time you might have to deal with these types of personality issues, and you have to deal with it in a manner that's appropriate and in a manner that's going to make your employee feel comfortable and more productive. You don't want to irritate or agitate the situation. This brings us to the end of the section on team performance and conflict management. The beauty of this section of work is that it does not only apply in business, which means we can apply these concepts and procedures to our daily lives, as we will all be part of teams at some point, and we will all be part of situations where we will be faced with conflict. So I hope that what we have learned and what we have discussed in these last two videos will also help you in your daily lives and help you solve conflict that might arise, and help you to develop a team that you're working with that is successful in achieving their goals. So until next time, Have a lovely day further.